So you're forcing them to think about what is actually possible
Yeah.
instead of continuing down the rabbit hole of why they can't do something.
Welcome back to the Illuminated Path. This is episode 68. What are we talking about today?
We are talking about the language we use and how that really affects our programming, our mind, and just everything that we do. So it's really another kind of NLP concept, neuro-linguistic programming, and we'll get into it.
Yeah. How's the week? What's new? We took a little break.
Yeah, so I think we ended up taking about 3 weeks off. Our last episode that we recorded and aired was about like tips to manage stress during the holidays, and then we kind of realized we had to take some of our own advice and take a break.
Yeah.
Because of the fact that, it was the holidays and we had a lot going on, just a lot of plans, events,
Yeah, and you
and
were sick and then you weren't, and then you were sick again, and then I was sick, and it
yeah.
was kind of just a lot happening all at once. And yeah, I think
So
we
it was
both
our
needed
first
some.
like break. Well, we took 1 week off sometime before Thanksgiving, like
Mm-hmm.
just 1 week, and then that was our first like extended break.
Yeah.
But I feel like it was a good time to do it.
Yeah.
So yeah, Christmas was good. New Year's was good. We watched the Wicked movie on New Year's Eve. It was fantastic. Highly recommend if you haven't seen it.
Mm-hmm.
You were even dancing along a little
It was
bit.
great. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's 2025 and I'm excited for this new year.
Me too. Yeah.
How about you? Anything you want to add?
No,
No.
I think honestly, I feel like so much is changing all at once that I don't think I could really pinpoint one thing. I think there's a lot of really exciting stuff happening in our lives. Um, Not a ton to publicly share yet,
Yeah.
but yeah, I think, things are really, we're in an exciting chapter, I
Mhm.
think. So, okay, so talk to us about the language we use.
Yeah, so really NLP talks a lot about how everything that we say, like it is programming that we are whatever we're speaking, it ultimately really becomes our thoughts and our thoughts become our actions and our actions create our everyday, which creates our entire life. So, this is stuff that we've talked about before, but I wanted to get into just a few different things of like how to look at things differently, of things that we may be saying to ourselves and how we can like reframe it or question some of these things to make ourselves actually think about it differently.
Yeah.
So, some of what I wanted to mention is some of the language that we use often, but we don't necessarily question that language. So we may say things like I should or I shouldn't do something. We may say I must or I must not, or I can or I cannot. And these are all very much like you're kind of deciding like this is something that I am doing or am not doing. And it's about your ability to do something, right? Or your belief in your ability or
Mm.
whatever. So,
Like when I think of can and cannot, I think limitations of like, oh, I
absolutely.
can't do that. Um, and I always go back to when I read Rich Dad Poor Dad, and he talked about, if you say I can't afford this, you are setting that limitation.
Right.
You're saying you're maxed out. You don't have capacity to make more. Versus rewriting that script and asking the question of how can I afford this?
Mhm.
So, yeah, no, that was just something that came to mind.
I actually just saw something recently about a family like teaching their kids about money and trying not to like, make them have like a scarcity mindset. And it was very similar. They don't tell their kids we can't afford something. They say we have to plan for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Because, like, yeah, they don't maybe want to drop the money on it right now. So they tell them, like, we have to plan for it, which is a
yeah.
very real thing?
I think that's very
Um,
interesting, especially as I've been getting into watches, and there's people who are like, "Yeah, I'm gonna buy a $5,000 watch," and I'm like, you know, I I could go buy it, but I think for me it's value, but
right.
like
Worth.
I need to plan for it, like
Right.
so yeah.
Just a couple other examples. going back to kind of some of those wordings where I will or I won't, or it's possible or it's not possible.
Mm,
Now, the biggest thing is that a lot of times, maybe you're working with someone or you're talking to someone about these things and they ask you, well, why not?
yeah.
And you think like, oh, maybe like you think that's a good question. Okay. You're asked, well, why not? But why not oftentimes just makes the person answer by literally like telling why not, like giving more excuses, more reasonings behind the reason why they can't. They don't
Like
start to shift.
validating the
Yes.
impossible, you're
Right.
saying.
Yeah.
Okay.
So when you say, I can't do this, and I say, why not? And you say, well, I can't do
Mm,
it because of this, because of this, because I don't have this resource, because I don't have this time.
so it's kind of like a setup for like helping that person justify.
Exactly.
Okay.
And you might think, like, well, like it could be a good question, but the reality is like that's what typically happens is you're justifying your reasoning, you're just validating it, you're giving yourself more, just like pointing out all of the excuses.
Yeah.
And so that is not like the best way to go about it because you're never shifting your thinking. You're never like looking in another way of, okay, well, what is possible? So,
Well, it's not challenging you. It's kind
right,
of a chance to voice your limiting beliefs.
exactly. So instead of just like questioning why not, there's a way that you can actually shift it so that you're forcing your brain and yourself to like actually think of what is possible. So instead of, if you say I should or I shouldn't, you should say, well, what should I do?
Mm,
Or so then you're thinking of like what 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 would make the most sense in that instance. Or you can say like, well, what if you should? And you're questioning that again, like questioning further. Oh, well maybe like what if it is something I should do? Um if you say I must or I must not. Okay, well what must you do? And it's not like continuing to go down the rabbit hole of I mustn't do this, but you're trying to shift it into okay, well what must I do?
so give some examples because this is feeling like a very like abstract, over the top, bird's eye view.
Yeah. Okay, so I can or I can't, right? Um so you can say, well what can you do or what stops you?
Mm,
So instead of saying I can or I can't, so you say I can't go to the gym.
mm-hmm.
And instead of saying why not? And then having that person say, I don't have time, I don't have the resources, I don't have the money, I don't have gym clothes, whatever. Because again, they're just validating it.
Yeah.
You can say, well, what can you do
Like I can exercise here,
at
or I can
home?
go for a walk.
Exactly.
Okay, I see.
So you're forcing them to think about what is actually possible
Yeah.
instead of continuing down the rabbit hole of why they can't do something.
Well, I think it also encourages you to think about the kind of like incremental, like the stepping stones of it, of like maybe I can't achieve that full goal today,
Mm,
but I can work toward it in some capacity.
yeah. And that's something that you and I recently talked about too. I don't remember what we called it, but like kind of like the bare minimum,
Yeah.
right? Of like we have this
Oh,
ideal situation of what we want to accomplish in a
the
day.
ceiling and the floor. Yeah.
Right, like, I want to go for a walk, go to the gym, I want to get in the sauna, I want to,
Yeah.
have time for music, have time for leisure, socializing, also have time for work, play with the dogs, like, all of these things, but the reality is most days, all of those things don't happen, so
Right.
what is possible?
So like that's the ceiling. And then
Right,
we
that's
need to figure
everything.
out what's the floor.
Right,
Like what and this came from some podcast. I don't remember who it was. I think it was a doctor or something, but I loved the concept of it, which was really just, you can have your ideal, but what's the bare minimum? What's the absolute non-negotiables that has to happen?
right,
And I saw someone else talking about it who said like, my ceiling, my ideal routine is an hour and a half in the gym, sauna, ice bath, all of it. And, a 30-minute guided meditation, whatever. And he said, my floor, 10 minutes of push ups and a 2-minute meditation,
right,
So I think understanding that and having that frame of reference is really important, especially for us as business owners and business owners in general, where your schedule's always changing. I think it's really important.
Yeah. So again, what can you do? Like,
Yeah.
what is the minimum? So whether it's a full blown, like, I don't, like, I can't go to the gym because of like X, Y, and Z. Well, what can you do? Okay.
Yeah.
You can start working out at home. Okay. You don't have time for 30 minutes. Okay. Start doing 10 minutes. Like,
Yeah.
what can you do? Start actually deciding what is possible and making strides and steps towards that. And you're also, again, the whole thing is like the language you're using, you're programming yourself to believe and figure out, well, what is possible? Because then you like, you're saying it, you're figuring it out, you're really more solution thinking.
Yeah.
And then you're programming your brain to believe what you can do. And your belief is literally like the foundation of everything.
Yeah. And I think that's really important too, because at its core, it's perspective shift. It's understanding how to look at a situation to, work on a solution or create some sort of possibility rather than only seeing the limitations.
Right. So instead of asking why, ask what can you do?
Yeah.
What is possible then? Um and a lot of times another question that's often asked, either you're asking yourself or someone else is asking you is, well, what's stopping you?
Yeah.
And that again is like kind of more reason to just think of excuses and think of the barriers, right? And validating those barriers. But instead, like, the realizing the truth is that it's more than likely your belief that is stopping you. Just
Mm,
simply your belief that you think you can do something.
yeah.
So another thing you can ask is, well, what's the reason? Like, what's the reason why I believe this? And that the reason you can ask that is just trying to get to the truth of what's going on here behind these beliefs.
Yeah. And I think that one's really powerful because it always makes me think about a lot of times like the programming that we received as children, right? Especially growing up, getting your first job or, whatever it was. Like I had a bad relationship with money, but that wasn't um it wasn't something that really developed until I, you know, really got into adulthood. But I think, growing up, absolutely there were times my parents were like, we can't afford that. Um and I don't think people realize how much they carry that into their lives, especially as you get older. It's something that you heard, so it's something that you start saying. Or, go to school so you can get a good job. And then you have this belief of, oh, I can't afford it, but I got to climb the ladder. And there's this cycle that people are in that a lot of it is beliefs that were given to them.
Mhm.
So I think that question of being able to ask what's the reason a lot of times will go into your programming and how you grew up and what you were exposed to, but also of course your beliefs
Right.
and how you feel about things.
Yeah. So it's really like asking what's the reason behind these thoughts, like these beliefs,
Yeah.
and starting to question those, not like what's the reason you can't do it, because again, that just makes you start coming up with excuses.
Yeah.
And also when you're thinking of, other options and things, I meant to mention this before, when you're thinking of like, what can I do? What is possible? When you start to come up with different options and alternatives and like, okay, maybe this or this or this, you're giving your brain more choices, which feels better. Because if you think the only way that I can, get healthy is by going to the gym an hour a day, 5 days a week, you're limiting yourself. And then you're like, but I can't do that.
Mm.
So you think that's the only option.
And
And
then if
then
you're not doing it, you think you're not healthy.
right. So you feel terrible. Okay. But if I have like these five options that I can do, then, you figure it out the day of. What
Yeah.
do I have time for today? What works in my schedule, or what do I have the energy for today? So giving options is always better than feeling like you don't have options.
Yeah. And I think we talked about that briefly too, but um, you always have more than one option. And if you think you only have one, you've got a chance to create some.
Yeah. It's about coming up with them, not that you just don't have any.
Right.
Um, yeah. And then we've talked about this before and maybe mentioned it earlier, but our brain is really always trying to prove ourselves to be right. So when we like decide something, like I I can't do this, and then you start coming up with reasons why and you're validating and you're, just building on that, you're going to do that. Like it is in your natural, just the way you are to want to prove yourself right. Your brain wants to be right. So because you had this thought, I can't, which comes from your programming, comes from the language you're using.
Fight or flight, comfort zone.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so much there. Yeah.
So because you had this thought, you want to continue to proving the thought correct,
Yep.
even if it's not actually true.
And oftentimes very limiting thoughts,
Yeah,
especially are what we try to prove true.
exactly. So it's important to really become aware of that and know that just because you had a thought doesn't mean it's true.
Yeah.
You can always change your thoughts. You can decide new thoughts that you want to create. We've had episodes on this before. I can't remember off the top of my head which ones exactly, but you're in charge of creating your thoughts and you have to like decide intentionally what thoughts you want to have and what would make those thoughts possible.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Absolutely. Anything else?
No, I think that's it.
All right. Thank you guys for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.